From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am Carolyn Brown. I direct the Office of Scholarly Programs and the John W. Kluge Center here at the library. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for a celebration. We love celebrations. And we are celebrating the publication of Marie Arana's book, Simon Bolivar, American Liberator. Ms. Arana wrote this, spent many months at the Kluge Center, I think it was about 10, 2 different periods, working on the book, doing research in the Hispanic division and other parts of the library. The book is done, as you all know, and we are here to celebrate it. But before we do that, if you would, if you have a cell phone or other electronic instrument that might go off, beep, interfere with the speaker, if you would please turn it off. The program, as I noted, is sponsored by the John W. Kluge Center, which was established in the year 2000 through a very generous donation by John W. Kluge to provide a venue on Capitol Hill where the world of ideas and the world of affairs, where the thinkers and the doers might have opportunities to come together for informal conversations. We also support scholars to get space and time, and those of you who do scholarship know that time is one of the rarest commodities of all when you're trying to do scholarship. Space and uninterrupted time to conduct research. We have residents at 2 levels at the very senior level, which of course is the level at which Marie was here. But we also have in our community a generation of the most promising rising scholars, many of whom are clustered over here on the left side of the room. And we look forward to the day, I won't be here, I don't think, but forward to the day when some of our junior fellows now return as senior scholars. It might take them 20 years or more, but the center also does lectures and small conferences. If you'd like to know more about us and sign up for alerts about what's going on, you can do so at the back of the room after the event. I think Marie Arana is probably known to everybody in this room, just about in some capacity, but maybe not all in the same capacity, because she wears multiple hats and wears them all superbly. Some of you will know her as an author. She has several books to her credit, Lima Nights and Cellophane, and her memoir, American Chica, 2 Worlds, One Childhood, which was a finalist for the 2001 National Book Award and the Penn Memoir Award. Others know her in another capacity as a literary critic. She was the editor-in-chief of Book World from 1999 to 2008, which you all remember as the literary section of the Washington Post, for which she still serves as writer at large. But I couldn't help saying many of us lament the disappearance of Book World, which was part of our Sunday morning, and even many years later we might complain quietly about it. But another hat, those of us at the library also know her as a senior consultant on Latin American affairs to the librarian, and as a key advisor to the library's annual National Book Festival. I think I could call her our secret weapon on that project. In addition, so here's another hat, she's a member of the Library Scholars Council, and beyond our walls, she serves on the board of directors of the National Book Critics Circle, National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and I could go on a while. One of the joys of my position as director of the Kluge Center is that sometimes I get to watch a project unfold. And I remember a very early conversation I had with Marie about this project. And she told me that it was really meant to be initially as just a small, quick book. I'm not remembering, something like 100 pages for either a young audience or a general audience or something. But, you know, Simon Bolivar had been, it seemed, was well known and had been well researched, and what more was there to say? So, 100 pages plus 500, a great deal more to say, and life has many surprises. And it's very interesting. If you look at the blurb, I like reading book blurbs sometimes, the very first line says, "It is astonishing that Simon Bolivar, the great liberator of South America, is not better known in the United States." Well, I would submit, ladies and gentlemen, that he is about to be better known in the United States. Please welcome Marie Arana.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Carolyn. I owe so much to Carolyn and to the Kluge Center. I don't think I could have written this book without the Kluge Center, and I want to thank everybody on your staff, Carolyn, and especially for your support, personal support, which was so important to me. But your wonderful staff, Marianne Rieker and Joanne Kitching and everybody else. And I want to thank Georgette Dorn, where are you, Georgette, for all the support over the years and for co-hosting this function. I'm very grateful to you. And of course, I want to thank Dr. James Billington for his really, truly visionary leadership in this, what I call Mecca of scholarship. I got to know the Library of Congress, as Carolyn said, through the National Book Festival, 12 years of working on the National Book Festival with John Cole and Guy Lamolinara. And then over the years, coming to Kluge, allowed me a more intimate view of the institution. And now I'm really very fortunate to be sitting in the librarian's office and working for Dr. Billington, and who is really, as you all know, a man who cares deeply about the culture of the book and the creative and intellectual life of this country and the knowledge and wisdom that is required in a true democracy. So thank you, Carolyn and Dr. Billington, and the Deputy Librarian, Bob Dysart, for your support too, and all my friends here. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'd like to start by telling you how I came to the subject of Bolivar, how it was that, as Carolyn described me, a person of too many hats, books editor, memoirist, novelist, former book publishing executive, and otherwise happily promiscuous intellectual dilettante, came to want to plumb every detail of one life, and how that life over the years came to represent for me something very important about Latin American identity. It began, truth be told, as some scholarly pursuits can, as a form of punishment. When I was a child in Lima, Peru, I was made to atone for my very naughty behavior by being forced to sit alone on a stool in my grandparents' living room. It was a dark, forbidding room, airless, shuttered against the fog and the sun of Lima. And there were books in glass bookcases, and there was an ornately carved piano, and there were inlaid tables, and a marble bust of a beguiling African princess, and 3 ancestral portraits painted more than 100 years before I was born. And one portrait was of an imposing brigadier general named Joaquin Rubin de Celis, who was my great-great-great-grandfather. And he was the first Spaniard to charge and the first to fall in the Battle of Ayacucho, which was the defining battle, the Yorktown, or Waterloo, if you will, of the Latin American Wars of Independence. The wistful, wan beauty who stared at him from the other wall was the daughter he never knew, Trinidad Rubin de Celis. She was born a few weeks after he was killed. 16 years later, at the age of 16, Trinidad married the man in the third portrait, my great-great-grandfather, Pedro Cisneros Torres. And Pedro Cisneros had fought in Bolivar's army under Antonio José de Sucre. In other words, Pedro was one of the rebels who had stormed down the Andes on that crisp December day in 1824, eager to slay his future wife's father. So you see, I had been told to sit there and think about my badness and my naughtiness, but all I could think of was the wickedness of all that, the glories of rebellion, people trying to kill their future father-in-laws, that's so, and how I was the logical result of all that anger. It sort of made me happy. But decades later, remembering that family history and trying to parse what it is that makes Latin Americans the way we are, I began to be fascinated by the man at the crucible of that American moment, Simon Bolivar. Now, there's no shortage of books on Bolivar. Here in the Library of Congress alone, the last time I checked, there are 2,683 volumes. Most of them are in Spanish, dozens are in Bolivar's own words or written by his contemporaries, and a great many more were written after he was dead and gone, and they're filled with hagiography or vitriol. He was a controversial man, but researching his life, I soon learned that there's a very big difference in reading Bolivar and reading about Bolivar. Works about Bolivar can be surprisingly tendentious, depending on the nationality of the writer. Venezuelans, of course, tend to idolize him. Spaniards are irked by his burning hatred of Spain. Colombians revere him, although they also manage to simultaneously revere his enemies, including those who tried to assassinate him. Bolivians tend to favor Bolivar because, of course, he favored them. Ecuadorians are grumpy that his letters show them in such a bad light. And Peruvians, above all, despise Bolivar because the Peru that Bolivar left behind was a fragment of what it once had been. After the revolution, Peru, which was the heart of the Spanish Empire in South America, its medulla of power, the richest viceroyalty of them all, became just another republic, not any bigger or better than any of its neighbors. So you can imagine when I, a Peruvian American, would tell people that I was writing a book about Bolivar, they would say, "Aha, I know exactly what you're going to write." The challenge was to ignore a sea of opinion and get at the man in the primary documents. And what riches of primary documentation I was able to find here at the Library of Congress. Let me just tell you about a few of them. Bolivar's own writing, of course, when there are 32 volumes of letters collected by Daniel Florencio Liri, which were then re-edited by Vicente Lecuna, and so you have this tremendous richness of vibrant, vivid language that Bolivar would write. And he would write sort of willy-nilly. He loved to write, he said he wrote best in the middle of a ballroom dancing. And he said, and all that sort of dancing would get him thinking, even as he was careening around the floor, and he would dash off to the side and dictate 3 letters at a time, 4 letters at a time, very much the way that Julius Caesar and Napoleon used to do, to his adjutants, and then dash back to the ballroom and dance some more. His writing was quite amazing. Then the court documents, which I found extraordinary. from the 18th century that I found here, documents from 1795, 97, which are here in the Library of Congress. And they tell, for instance, of a case which was brought against the families of Simon Bolivar, because Bolivar was an orphan. He was orphaned very young in life by his mother and then by his father. He was traded between, because he was, as a little boy, very rich Venezuelan. He had been given a tremendous inheritance by a very wealthy priest who was his uncle. And so this little boy was fought over in the courts. And you could see, his running away and then his being brought back by the archbishop to the house where he belonged. And all of this is here in court documentation in the library. Maps of the old streets of Caracas. I found myself staring at maps, and the longer I stared, the more I saw things that I hadn't read anywhere before. For instance, Bolivar's father was a terrible sexual predator. He was so terrible that the bishop was after him all the time. He was accosting women in houses. He was accosting women in public places. He was trying to rape his maids. And he was being brought before the archbishop all the time. And of course, the archbishop said, I'm going to pretend I'm not believing these stories. But if you don't straighten up, I don't know what I'm going to have to do. And eventually, Bolivar's father decided he had to marry. In fact, the archbishop said, you better get married. At the age of about 46, he got married, and he married a 14-year-old girl. Well, looking at the maps, I could see that Bolivar's father's house, Don Juan Vicente's house, was contiguous to the house where this little girl that he married, 14 years old, he was 46, lived. So you can imagine, he had fought in the same battalion with this little girl's father in Puerto Cabello. So you can imagine, and I can imagine it with you, and I didn't see it, I hadn't read it anywhere else, but there there are contiguous properties. There's this man, there's his war buddy who lives next door, and there's this little girl growing up. And that's the one he marries, and that's the one that's Bolivar's mother. I also found a long fold-out graphic that some very obsessed Venezuelan had done of every kilometer that Bolivar had ever traveled in his comings and goings, and in these little zigzags that fold out, and you could see where he'd gone back and forth across the seas or whatever. An amazing sort of visual aid to a biographer, if you can imagine. And then, of course, there are chronicles by his generals, his mercenaries, his soldiers, by travelers who were, by chance, witness to the revolution. And the writing was often vibrant, brimming with observations, and full of color. Reviewers have commented that my book reads like a novel, which, you don't want a biography to read like a novel exactly, at least not when you have been a novelist and you're trying to be a biographer, But it pleases me, but it's not because of my vivid imagination. I really did find all the color that I needed in those primary documents. Bolivar's own writing, as I said, is brisk, lively, full of passion, full of drama. And where his words weren't enough, I had the chronicles of his contemporaries. One of those chronicles, featured on the very first page of my book, is a description of Bolivar by one of his soldiers, a very talented young painter named José María Espinosa, who went on to produce some of the most famous portraits of Bolivar. He had followed Bolivar into battle as a teenager, sat with him, traced his features, and chatted with him. And when in 1876, this soldier published his memoir of the revolution, which was called Memorias de un Abanderado, He included a cameo description of a marvelous moment, downright cinematic, at a critical junction in Bolivar's career. The scene takes place immediately after the Battle of Boyacá, which was the conflict in 1819 that turned the tide for Bolivar. And it's a sort of jewel that turns up now and then in primary documents that makes a biographer's heart pound. The painter describes a sweltering afternoon, the sweltering afternoon of the Battle of Boyacá, when he and two other rebel soldiers are standing on a roadside, just off the main road, actually, to Bogotá. Suddenly, they hear the sound of galloping hooves. As they watch the rider emerge from the distance, they can barely make out the figure crouched over a magnificent white horse. The figure is small, thin, gaunt. His long hair is whipping in the wind. He is shirtless. His chest is bare under his raggedy blue jacket. A black cape is fluttering around his shoulders. At first, they think he's a Spaniard. They run into the road and shout for him to stop. One even threatens him with his lance, but the rider gallops ahead and ignores them. When he gets close enough to render his features unmistakable, he turns to glare at the soldier who is menacing him, and he says, "Soy yo." It's I. Don't be a dumb son of a bitch. Now, does it get better than that? I couldn't have dreamed that up. It took a painter with a vivid, sort of colorful eye to bring it to me, and I stumbled on that description in an ancient little volume, 1867, in the magnificent Spanish language collection of this library. Bolivar was 36 years old at the Battle of Boyacá, and although he would die of tuberculosis 11 years and many dozens of battles later, he seemed at that moment vibrant and strong and filled with a boundless energy. For all his physical slightness, he was only 5'6" and 130 pounds. There was an undeniable intensity about the man. His eyes were piercing black, his gaze was penetrating, his forehead was deeply lined, his cheekbones were high, chiseled, his teeth perfect, white, his smile surprising and radiant. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink, he bathed twice, sometimes 3 times a day. Official portraits show a less than imposing man, the meager chest, the impossibly thin legs, the hands that look like a woman. But when Bolivar entered a room, his power was palpable. When he spoke, his voice was galvanizing. He had a magnetism that seemed to dwarf sturdier men. He enjoyed good cuisine, but could endure days, even weeks, of punishing hunger. He spent backbreaking hours in grueling campaigns. By the end, he had traveled 75,000 miles on horseback. Now that's like going from Anchorage, Alaska, to Tierra del Fuego 5 times. His stamina in the saddle was legendary. Even the llaneros, the cowboys, the riders of the plains in Venezuela, called him with all admiration, Iron Ass. But he was equally comfortable in a ballroom or at the opera. He was a superb dancer, a spirited conversationalist, a cultivated man of the world. And he read widely and could quote in many, many languages, including Rousseau in French and Caesar in Latin. He was a widower at the age of 19 and a sworn bachelor, and he was also an insatiable womanizer. By the time Bolivar was galloping toward Bogotá in the scene that I've just described, his name was already known around the world. In Washington, John Quincy Adams and James Monroe agonized over whether the fledgling Republic of the United States, in which a slave trade was booming, the slave trade was the largest GNP item in the American agenda, whether this country, with all its investment in the slave economy, should support a patriot army whose ranks were populated by liberated slaves, blacks, pardos, Indians. In London, out-of-work veterans who had just left the Napoleonic Wars and were out of money decided to sign on to the patriot cause, to the Bolivar's cause. And you can imagine these soldiers coming from these Irish and Englishmen who were being sent off with great sort of bands playing in London in full regalia with hats and feathers and, brass-studded uniforms, going off to fight a war in which the soldiers they would join were barefoot, carrying sticks. But there would be many more years of horrifying violence before Spain was thrust from the South American shores. In the battlefields of Venezuela alone, there were more dead than in the North American Revolution and the Civil War combined. At the end of that chastening war, one man would be credited with single-handedly conceiving, organizing, and leading the liberation of 6 nations, a population 1.5 times the size of North America, a landmass the size of modern Europe. The odds against which he fought, a formidable established world power, vast areas of untracked wilderness, splintered loyalties of many races, would have proved daunting for the ablest of generals with strong armies at his command. But Bolivar had never been a soldier. He had no formal military training, yet with little more than will and a genius for leadership, he freed much of Spanish America and laid out his dream for a unified continent. And yet, he was a highly imperfect man. He could be impulsive, headstrong, filled with contradictions. He spoke eloquently about justice, but he wasn't always able to mete it out in the chaos of revolution. His romantic life had a way of spilling out sloppily into the public realm. He had trouble accepting criticism. He had no patience for disagreements. He was totally incapable of losing a game of cards. It's hardly surprising that over the years, Latin Americans have learned how to accept human imperfections in their leaders. Bolivar taught them how. As years passed, he became known as the George Washington of South America. Actually, General Lafayette gave him that moniker. There were good reasons why. Both he and Washington came from rich, influential families. Both were defenders of freedom. Both were heroic in war, but apprehensive about marshaling the peace. Both resisted efforts to make them kings. Both claimed to want to return to private lives, but were called instead to shape governments. Both were accused of undue ambition. And there, the similarities end. Bolivar's military action lasted more than twice as long as Washington's. The territory he covered was 7 times as large and spanned an astonishing geographic diversity, from crocodile-infested jungles to the snow-capped reaches of the Andes. There's nothing as dramatic as that climb over the Andes in the middle of terrible freezing temperatures, losing all his men, all his cattle, most of his horses as he went, much of his ammunition, and then tumbling down the other side to surprise the Spaniards where they least expected him to come. It was an astonishing feat. But he couldn't, unlike Washington's war, Bolivar could not have won his war without the aid of Black and Indian troops. His success in rallying all the races became a turning point in the wars for independence. It's fair to say that he simultaneously fought a revolution and a civil war. But perhaps what distinguishes Washington and Bolivar above all can be seen most clearly in their written works. Washington's words were measured, dignified, the product of a cautious mind. Bolivar's speech and correspondence, on the other hand, are fiery, passionate. They represent some of the greatest writing, I think, in Latin America. Although much was produced in haste, you can imagine, as I said, on the ballroom, in the battlefield, on the run. The prose is lyrical, stately, clever, historically grounded, electric, deeply wise. It's no exaggeration to say, I think, that Bolivar changed the Spanish language. The old dusty Castilian of his time, with all of its ornate flourishes and all its sort of cumbersome locutions, in his voice and his pen became another language entirely. It became urgent, vibrant, and young. I urge you to read his Manifesto of Cartagena or any of his letters, any one of his letters. And then there's yet another important difference. Unlike Washington's glory, Bolivar's did not last unto the grave. In time, the politics in the countries that Bolivar had created grew ever more fractious. His detractors were ever more vehement. Eventually, he came to believe that Latin Americans were actually not ready for democracy. They were not ready for a democratic government. They were abject, ignorant, suspicious. They didn't understand how to govern themselves, having been systematically deprived of that experience by their colonial masters. What they needed, in his eyes, eventually, was a strong hand and a strict executive. He began making unilateral decisions. He installed a dictator in Venezuela. He wrote into the Bolivian constitution a president for life. By the time he was 41, his wisdom began to be doubted by everyone, every functionary in the republics that he had freed and founded. His deputies became jealous and wary of his extraordinary power, truly extraordinary power, and they declared that they no longer wanted to support his dream of a unified America. Regionalisms emerged, followed by border squabbles and civil wars, and in Bolivar's own halls, cloak and dagger betrayals. And trumped, in the end, he had no choice but to renounce his command. His 47th and final year ended in poverty, illness, and exile. He had been born rich, to perhaps one of the richest families in all of South America, but having given away the sum total of his personal fortune to the revolution, he died a poor and ravaged man. Few heroes in history have been dealt so much honor, so much power, and so much ingratitude. And few have survived that utter humiliation to go on to be so revered. I found Bolivar's life to be one of history's most dramatic canvases. It's a colossal narrative replete with adventure and disaster. Some of his campaigns were disastrous, literally disastrous. More were victorious. His wars of independence took 14 years, and in the course of an absolutely devastating violence, he was beaten often, exiled twice, but he always came back more fierce for his failures. As he himself once said, "The art of victory is learned in defeat." It was while he was in exile that he decided that the only way to achieve his goals was to engage all the races. He engaged the help of blacks, of Indians, of mulattos, mestizos. He got help from the English and Dutch merchants, from the newly free of the blacks of Haiti, from the pirates of the Caribbean, from the wild plainsmen of the Apure, from invalids in hospitals where he went and recruited soldiers, from boys as young as 12 whom he recruited to his ranks. To populate his armies, he freed slaves a full half-century before the Emancipation Proclamation. Some historians say that there are more similarities than differences between the histories of North and South Americas, that English and Spanish colonizers, quote, dreamed comparable dreams and shared common nightmares, unquote. Some claim that there is a Pan-American narrative in which the Puritan and Catholic experiences on either side of the hemisphere are actually very similar. Well, I respectfully disagree. What I learned in the course of writing this book is that a fundamental character emerged from the Spanish-American experience, a character akin to Simon Bolivar's, very different from North America's. It centers on the question of Spanish colonialism, which comes down ultimately to the questions of power and race. Even though by Bolivar's time, the Spanish colonies had gone through 300 years of racial mixing, and according to Bolivar, by the way, no one with deep ancestral roots in South America knows to which race he truly belongs. Even so, in the 18th century, when the revolutionary movement began, Spain was still registering the differences, counting births by the baby's color, imposing penalties on the darker castes. As I said, until Bolivar won the colored races to his side, the revolution floundered. He could not have succeeded without their participation. Independence depended on that fleeting window of interracial cooperation. It is a very, very different narrative from the one that defines the United States of America. Race was not South America's only challenge. Other colonial legacies left indelible marks on the continent. Under Spain, apart from Catholic conversion, education was routinely denied the masses. This great rift in education was Bolivar's greatest worry. The reason he began to doubt that democracy, US style, could ever work among South Americans, the reason he began to believe in a strong executive. There were other deep and abiding influences. Spain's control of books, of news, of every aspect of communication, its strict prohibition of manufacturing, its policy to keep colonies apart. Simón Bolívar understood these difficult legacies. He understood that being a colony of Spain was fundamentally different from being a colony of England. Spain had been at once crueler and more humane, whereas Spain's laws of the Indies were tyrannical. The colonists had actually married and interbred with the colonized. A mestizo population began to emerge right after the conquistadors arrived. Not one founder of the United States traveled a similar circuit. Not one undertook to bring democratic principles to such a complicated mosaic of humanity, nor did any American founder fall so precipitously from grace. The difference, I think, is revealing. The swift unraveling of a hero is a story that is played out again and again in contemporary Latin American politics. We've seen it in Juan Perón, Alberto Fujimori, Augusto Pinochet, Anastasio Somoza, and countless others who have risen to glory, arrogated supreme power, then met with a plummeting demise. The cycle is mythic by now, and it is totally Bolivarian. With time, Bolivar became the heart of the South American story. Certainly, his type is deeply embedded in the region's psyche. It's an image that is all too easily bent to every purpose. As Garcia Marquez once said, when I write about Bolivar, I'm writing about myself. Perhaps every Latin American feels that to some degree. We ensure his immortality by recreating him again and again. And the irony is that he is used by followers and detractors alike, by extreme left, by extreme right. As the American historian Lester Langley once said, will the real Bolivar please stand up? Dead, Bolivar became a symbol. His failures as a politician receded. His successes as a liberator took center stage. Indeed, the accomplishments were irrefutable. It was he who had disseminated the spirit of enlightenment, brought the promise of democracy to the hinterlands, opened the minds and hearts of Latin Americans to what they could become. It was he who, with a higher moral instinct, even than Washington or Jefferson, saw the absurdity of embarking on a war for liberty without first emancipating his own slaves. It was he who had led the armies, slept on the ground with his soldiers, fretted about their horses, their bullets, their maps, their blankets, inspired men to unimaginable victories. Never before in the history of the Americas had one man's will transformed so much territory, united so many races. Never had Latin America dreamed so large. But in the course of forging a new world, compromises were made. More than once, Bolivar found himself tossing the ideals by the wayside as he rode through the roiling hell of a brutal war, through the abattoirs of improvised military justice. He made questionable decisions. Bolivar's critics are quick to cite them, and let me cite them for you. The decree of war to the death, la guerra de muerte, for instance, in which for a period of several months, all followers of the Spanish crown were condemned to extermination. There was more that didn't quite fit the model of an enlightened society. His execution of his own general, Manuel Piar, a young, ambitious mulatto patriot who Bolivar suspected was trying to incite a race war under his very nose. The massacre of 800 Spanish prisoners at Puerto Cabello because a prison uprising was feared and there were not enough guards to control them. Bolivar had been scuttled by a prison uprising in his early career, and so he wasn't about to let it happen again. The betrayal of his aging fellow liberator, Francisco Miranda, who Bolivar felt had capitulated too easily, surrendered the patriot cause, and sold out the revolution to Spain, Bolivar himself took his old mentor, turned him in, and Miranda was sent to die in a prison just outside of Cadiz. Last, and certainly not least, was the fact that Bolivar had taken on dictatorial powers no less than 3 times. He had great arguments for all of it. There was, to begin, a continent's staggering ignorance. There was also the swift, very swift, draconian response of Spain when it learned that a revolution was afoot. After the Napoleonic Wars, the Madre Patria emerged fierce, more terrible, more sharpened by combat than patriots could have imagined. You know, Miranda himself thought he could prosecute the revolution very easily without shedding any blood. It was impossible. Violence was met by more violence, and soon escalation became the only rule of war. The result was a bloody conflict that wiped whole cities from the map, reduced civilian populations by 1/3, and virtually obliterated Spain's expeditionary forces. In the course of liberating so much of South America, Bolivar became a master of improvisation, a military commander who could outwit, outride, and outfight a vastly more powerful enemy. But that very malleability, that genius for moving swiftly from strategy to strategy, for rebounding quickly, for making decisions on the fly, had its liabilities in times of peace. It's difficult to build a democracy on a wartime model. It was why, after the wars were done, he made hasty decisions, last-ditch promises, political blunders. It was why he tried to patch his way through the political process, saying different things to different men. But for all his flaws, there was never any doubt about his power to convince, his splendid rhetoric, his human impulses, his deeply held principles of liberty and justice. As years went by and South Americans remembered that greatness, they understood that their liberator had been well before his time. Leaders who followed seemed wanting in comparison, dwarfed by his shadow of a colossus. The countries he liberated began to revive the legend. Cities and provinces started taking his name. Public plazas were raised as monuments to his victories. In marble or in bronze, Bolivar's flesh took on a serenity it never had in life. The restless, fevered liberator became the benevolent father, the devoted teacher, the good shepherd striving to build a better flock. As the legend grew, each one building on the last, the man took on a protean quality. Politicians used him to defend their positions. Priests quoted him in righteous sermons. Poets lionized him in ecstatic verse. History texts swooned over his exploits, and teachers pointed to his brilliance, and fathers said, "Son, be like Bolivar." In time, historians too took up the glorification. Whole institutions and scholarly apparatuses were put in place to defend him, and defend him they would, for the debunkers would be many, those who preferred to glorify San Martin, Spaniards who felt obliged to defend the Madre Patria, mercenaries who never did get paid, even the vociferous Karl Marx, who called Bolivar a bully and a blackguard. But all that would come later. By the time the 100th anniversary of Bolivar's birth came around, the myth was in place, augmented with surprising flourishes. The intervening centuries had made Bolivar a good Catholic, which he never was, a moral exemplar, an unwavering Democrat, none of which he'd ever been during his life. The story had less to do with him than with a romantic ideal. He was our better angel, our Prince Valiant. Even the imperfections, the dozens of mistresses, the take no prisoners, bravado, the penchant for dictatorship, were seen as natural parts of the Latin American persona, what every young Latino should aspire to be. As the writer José Martí so famously wrote of Bolivar, nothing is more beautiful than that craggy forehead, those cavernous eyes, that cape flapping against him on the back of a winged horse. From sun to sun, for as long as America shall live, the echo of his name will resound in our manly hearts. And indeed, over time, Bolivar's name has prevailed. To this day, his legacy is very much alive. There are political parties throughout South America, whole ideologies, even a republic dedicated to his name. There's nothing quite like it in the rest of the world. There is no George Washington Party in the United States. There's no Jeffersonian Republic of America. There are no people who shout Napoleon's name today in the streets of Paris. But in Latin America today, Bolivar lives on as a galvanizing force, a lightning rod for political action. Perhaps it's because, in many ways, the revolution is still afoot in Latin America. Although Bolivar's name has been conjured by every ism that succeeded him, his ideals were lost in the ensuing political chaos. Principles of the Enlightenment were cast aside as the white aristocracy scrambled to appropriate the wealth and power the Spanish overlords had left behind. Equality, which Bolivar had insisted was the linchpin of justice, was quickly replaced by a virulent racism and a hierarchy as rigid as the colonial system ever had been. The rule of law, indispensable to a free people, was abandoned as one dictator after another rewrote laws according to his caprices. Democracy, equality, these have been slow to come to South America. Unity, which Bolivar believed would have made the continent a mighty force, was never realized. And yet, his legend lives on. Perhaps this is because Bolivar's life has always spoken so clearly to the Latin American people. Here is an all too imperfect man who, with a keen mind, an ardent heart, and admirable disinterest, carried a revolution to far corners of the continent. Here is a leader whom fate presented with one opportunity and a glut of insuperable hurdles. A general betrayed by his own officers, a strategist who had no equals on whom he could rely, a head of state who oversaw nothing that resembled a vigorous, unified team of rivals. With a stamina that is probably unmatched in history, he prosecuted a seemingly unwinnable war over a harsh terrain to shuck the formidable banner of Pizarro from the Caribbean coast all the way down to the heart of the continent. In Potosí, there was little that stopped him. It is, and I hope you agree, a great American story. Thank you so much. Thanks very much. I'd love to take some questions if you have them. Questions are always the best part. Yes?
Did Bolivar have any principles that he thought the governments he was striving to create should follow? Whether he expressed them, did he actually try to bring them about? What did he think about a legal system?
Oh, yes.
Economics, what kind of...
Yes, he had very much in mind to reproduce the English system. He liked the English system very much. He thought it would actually work much better at the very beginning. He was not a man of the desk. He had built institutions. If you go through South America, you see the universities that he built. You see the court system that he built. And yet, every time he left a town or a city behind, things would fall apart behind him. He had a very clear vision of what he wanted, but he had very little help in actually executing what he had in mind. And you have to understand that after 14 years of violent warfare, the people were tired. People had very little will left in them, and there was a great deal of a kind of factionalism that was fighting any kind of unified decision. So there were a million things working against him. But yes, he had very, very distinct notions of how the democratic principle should be put into action. Thank you. Yes.
About 2 months ago, you were up in Politics and Prose promoting your book, and I asked you why Bolivar wouldn't work with San Martin, and your answer, which I'm going to try and summarize, was that Bolivar had said if I had agreed to let him serve under me, he would have had the moral edge on me, and that would have been more than I could have handled. Does that summarize it approximately?
I'm sorry, I somehow I didn't get the whole question.
Okay.
What was your question?
I had asked you why Bolivar refused to work with San Martin when they met in
in the meeting at Guayaquil?
Yeah, and your answer was to the effect that Bolivar had said that if I had agreed to let him serve under me, he would have had the moral edge.
Yes.
And that's more than I could have handled.
Right.
Is that a good summary?
That's a good summary, yes. Why didn't you include the book? You did read the book.
Yes, why didn't you include it in the book?
It was a fascinating moment, which was, thank you for reading the book, and thank you for quoting it back to me. My goodness. Somehow the words seemed alien and strange. The moment in Guayaquil when Bolivar sat down and met with San Martin was not witnessed by anybody but those two men. And the only way that we have any understanding of what happened is in correspondence after the fact. And in letters, Bolivar began to say what actually happened. San Martin was begging for support. He had been able to liberate the city of Lima, but he had not been able to liberate all of Peru. And his army was scattered and demoralized. He had great enemies among the Peruvians who were trying to depose him. And he was very sick. He had been sick for a long time and was addicted to opium and was getting weaker by the day. And he needed Bolivar's help. He came to Guayaquil and begged for it. And Bolivar, understanding that it was a matter of territorial right was sort of demurred, wasn't sure whether he wanted to help San Martin. And San Martin said, I will serve under you. At least this is what Bolivar reported. And Bolivar later said that he knew that for San Martin to say that he was going to serve under Bolivar would give would give San Martin the moral edge. He would become the hero who stepped aside. And of course, that's exactly what happened in history, at least in Peru. San Martin is the glorified hero because he had the grace to step aside. And you go to Lima, and Bolivar is, his statue is off to his side, inside somewhere, but San Martin is in the middle of the great plaza because San Martin was more, there's honor in that stepping aside. And Bolivar saw it from the very beginning. He knew that that was going to happen. Why isn't that in the book? Oh, it is, very much is. No. Read the part where Bolivar actually, it's there, believe me. Yes, Dr. Billington.
One of the attractive features of the exhibit we had of Jefferson and the way it was mounted was that you could take all the key phrases that conveyed what he wanted to get across in the Declaration of Independence, and you could trace the origins back almost literally to some book that he had read. Mm-hmm. Now, they were mostly from the British and French traditions, a combination of the Scottish, French Enlightenment, and so forth. Now, is there a comparable way you can take the characteristic phrases that Bolivar used in his career to a distinctive cohort of Spanish thinkers or activists or people that can help us kind of understand what was at the core of his formation? That's the first question. And then the second question, if you take him as a kind of leader of people, which he clearly was, and diverse peoples at that, the terminology that was invented in the resistance to Napoleon, which began with the Peninsular War in Spain, was of course guerrilla, the little war. And the second term that originated during that period to describe the resistance was partisan, which was Russian, the Russian contribution. They were the two conflicts that fundamentally defeated Napoleon on the ground, where he had to ultimately be defeated. Now, is there a comparable term that was invented, or a set of terms or image that is characteristic of the extraordinary resistance he made to an even greater and more diverse empire that he led? Really, he led to its dismemberment much more effectively than anything in Spain itself. Mm-hmm. So there's sort of two questions that are perhaps trying to figure out: are they similar? You established the differences and the uniqueness of Bolivar, but are there things you can tell us who are not real well-versed, those of us not well-versed in the Hispanic sources, that emerge from your unique immersion in this world?
Wonderful questions. It's striking, and I try to go into this somewhat in the book, Dr. Billington. The inspirations for Bolivar were not from Spanish literature or from Spanish philosophers at all. They were truly, he was inspired by the Enlightenment. He was inspired by Rousseau. He was inspired by the rights of man. He was inspired by Montesquieu. He was far broader, in a sense, than dipping into his own roots. He was his antenna were out in the world. And he had, as a child, wonderful teachers. He had Andres Bello, who was became a great literary figure in Latin America. So he was very aware of the literary legacy of a Spanish-speaking population. But he chose to go with the writers of the Enlightenment, those who were very much on the tongues of people at the time. And Montesquieu had said at one point, you get to a point where what did he call it? I think it was the accoutrement is actually more important than the figure that is wearing it. And that image so took Bolivar, because he knew that the colonies, which were the accoutrement, had become far more important and potentially more powerful than Spain itself, which was withering on the vine. So those images, that French Enlightenment thought was very, very persuasive to Bolivar, and he took it lock, stock, and barrel. As for your second question about whether there's a kind of term like partisan, at the time you read the letters of the time, and they talk of themselves as patriotas. They're the rebels. They talk of themselves as patriots and rebels, and they're using terms really from the French and American Revolution when you think about it, and these had seeped in to the population at large, because at that point information about those two revolutions had become pretty widespread. But I can't think. I have to think about it and come back to you. I'll come knock on your door if I think of a term that actually arose, the original term that arose from the revolution. Well, I'll tell you what I think did emerge, which is that it was in the military that these races fused. And it was in the military, and it's true in this country as well, but it was true in Latin America way before it began to be in this country. The military became the symbol of a kind of racial fusion, and a way for, very quickly, and we're talking about the early 1800s. The people of different races were coming up in the military. The military, I think, is the image that was unifying, and it's an image that's very, very hard to get out of the Latin American model, because the Latin American countries are inclined to say, well, the military is the solution, because at one time it so clearly was. Yes.
What did Bolivar think of Napoleon?
Oh, very, very divided opinion. He was quite interested in Napoleon. And he was in France at the time that Napoleon was in power. And he was in Paris at the time that Napoleon put the crown on his own head. So he didn't like that part of it. I think he writes about it quite a bit. And people who chronicle Bolivar write about his obsession with Napoleon. He admired the way that Napoleon was so effective and so quickly powerful and so charismatic. He admired that, but that impulse to be an emperor, to be he was very, very much against it. He also admired Napoleon. I mean, he saw Napoleon in Italy at one point, reviewing the troops, and he saw that Napoleon was not dressed up in ermine, but he had his little cap, and he was very, very modestly dressed. And Bolivar took that to heart. He began, I think very early on in his command, to be quite humble in his clothing because of that image. He remembered that of Napoleon, but he actually was very divided. He admired his the efficacy of Napoleon's sort of command, but he didn't like that impulse to glory, although Bolivar had plenty of that impulse himself. One more question?
Hola, Marie.
Hola.
Since the Spanish had conquered the Americas, every 10 to 20 years there had been an uprising. So over 300 years, maybe 24 uprisings. What had changed, or what did Bolivar bring, or both, that allowed him to succeed where so many others had failed?
Absolute will to victory. I mean, he could not be stopped. He was, as I say, he kept getting destroyed at every turn. He kept getting thrown out. And there was it got to the point where he understood that he had to engage by virtue of charm, by virtue of getting the population on his side. He was able to do that right away. And I think that even Miranda, the population didn't trust him. There was a point when Miranda tried to come in 1806, and they laughed at him. He came in with his troops to liberate Latin America, and they just, said, who is that crazy guy? But with Bolivar, he was persuasive. He was extraordinarily persuasive by virtue of, I think, his command, verbal command, but he was able to inspire trust, at least in the beginning. Thank you for the question.
As much as we hate to do so, I think it's probably time to draw this wonderful conversation to a close, but really to a different format, I would say, because we have books in the back for Marie to sign. We have a reception, and so please continue the informal conversation. But before we do that, let's thank Marie Arana one more time.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.